The Perpetual Gaze. The iron gate groaned a protest that seemed to echo from a century past, a rusty sigh swallowed by the overgrown wilderness that pressed in on all sides. Elias Thorne pushed it open, the cold metal an unwelcome chill against his palm, and stepped onto the crumbling asphalt drive. Before him, nestled deep within a thicket of skeletal oaks and weeping willows, stood Blackwood Manor. It wasn't merely old, it was ancient, a monolith of weathered stone and darkened timber that seemed to have forgotten the passage of time, existing instead in a perpetual twilight of its own making. A profound silence descended the moment the gate clanged shut behind him, a silence so complete it felt less like an absence of sound and more like a dense, heavy presence. The air itself tasted of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood or rust. Elias shivered, though the late autumn air was not particularly cold. It was the house, he knew, already reaching out, its unseen tendrils brushing against his composure. He had purchased Blackwood Manor sight unseen, a desperate act of academic obsession. His monograph on Echoes of the Unseen, Perceptions of Solitude in Early American Folklore demanded an immersion, a complete severance from the clamor of the modern world. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, no human contact for months. He craved the kind of profound solitude that sharpened the mind, that peeled back the layers of mundane reality to reveal the whispers beneath. He had found it, he realized now, in a place that seemed to actively repel warmth and light. The drive, choked with weeds and fallen branches, stretched like a forgotten vein towards the house. The grand facade, once imposing, was now merely intimidating. Windows, dark and vacant, stared out like hollow eyes, reflecting nothing but the bruised sky. A particularly gnarled oak, its branches like arthritic fingers, scraped rhythmically against the uppermost turret with each gust of wind, a sound like a creature clawing at its own prison. Elias clutched the heavy brass key in his gloved hand, its weight surprisingly substantial. His breath plumed white in the air as he approached the massive front door, an expanse of black oak studded with iron. The wood was cold, rough to the touch, and seemed to hum with an inert energy. He inserted the key into the lock, a mechanism so stiff it resisted for a long, agonizing moment before yielding with a series of metallic groans and clicks that grated on his nerves. The door swung inward, not with a dramatic creak, but with a sluggish exhalation, revealing an interior swallowed by shadows. The air inside was colder, denser, imbued with the scent of dust, decay, and something else indefinable, an ancient, stale breath that seemed to catch in his throat. It tasted like absence. He stepped across the threshold, and the heavy door, as if alive, slowly began to swing back, its momentum carrying it towards closure. Elias reached out, catching it just before it latched, a sudden, inexplicable panic seizing him at the thought of being sealed inside without his explicit consent. He wedged a stone against it, just enough to keep a sliver of the outside world visible, a slim gray ribbon of light. The grand foyer was a cavernous space, its ceiling lost in gloom, its walls lined with obscured portraits and tapestries. Dust motes danced in the sparse beams of light filtering through the grime-caked windows, appearing less like particles and more like restless, tiny spirits. His footsteps echoed unnaturally on the cold marble floor, each sound magnified, then swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed. He pulled a powerful LED lantern from his satchel, clicking it on. Its beam cut through the darkness, revealing the outlines of a sweeping staircase, its banister intricately carved but now coated in a thick velvet of dust. To his left, a vast drawing room shrouded in sheets that billowed slightly in the imperceptible draft. To his right, a study, its door ajar, revealing shelves overflowing with shadowed, unidentifiable volumes. Elias chose the study first. The room felt marginally less hostile than the grand hall. He pushed the door further open, the hinges protesting with a low groan. The air here was even heavier, smelling of old paper and something metallic, like iron filings or dried ink. He swept the lantern beam across the shelves. Thousands of books, their spines cracked and faded, lined the walls, stretching from floor to ceiling. A massive oak desk, its surface scarred and stained, dominated the center of the room. A leather-bound journal lying open upon it, its pages yellowed and brittle. He approached the desk cautiously, as if disturbing a sleeping beast. The journal lay open to a page filled with elegant but now faded script. He couldn't make out the words in the dim light, and a strange reluctance held him back from touching it. It felt less like a relic and more like a trap. A faint sound broke the heavy silence. A soft, almost imperceptible tap. It seemed to come from deeper within the house, perhaps upstairs. Elias froze, straining his ears. The wind outside had died down, leaving an absolute stillness. The tap didn't repeat. He shook his head. The house was old, settling. Every creak, every groan, every shift of wood and stone would be amplified in this oppressive quiet. His mind, already tuned to the macabre, was playing tricks. He spent the next few hours methodically opening the shutters in the downstairs rooms, letting slivers of weak sunlight penetrate the gloom. Each shutter groaned on its hinges. Each window pane was a canvas of grime and cobwebs. The dining room, vast and silent, held a long shrouded table. The kitchen, a relic of a bygone era, was filled with ancient, unusable appliances and a pervasive smell of stale grease. He found a small pantry, stocked with a few tins of preserved food, long expired, and a bag of hardened flour. The house felt like a living entity, observing him, its unseen gaze following his every move. He kept catching himself turning his head sharply, convinced he'd seen a shadow deepen in his peripheral vision or heard a soft rustle just behind him. Each time there was nothing, just the silence, thick and absorbent. As dusk approached, the house began to transform. The brief, pale sunlight receded, and the shadows, which had merely lurked, now expanded, becoming solid, predatory things. The already dim rooms plunged into a deeper, more profound darkness. The oak tree outside the turret began its rhythmic scratching again, a mournful, insistent sound. Elias resolved to make the study his temporary sanctuary. It had a fireplace, which he immediately set about cleaning. The chimney was clogged with years of soot and debris, and the process was a grimy, suffocating affair. He found a stack of ancient, brittle logs in a woodshed out back, each smelling faintly of damp rot. Finally, with a crackle and a plume of smoke, a meager fire sputtered to life in the hearth. The flickering flames cast dancing shadows across the walls, making the bookshelves seem to writhe, the portraits in the hall outside appear to grimace. The warmth, however, was a welcome balm against the pervasive chill that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the house. He set up his cot in a corner of the study, wrapped in several blankets he'd brought. He ate a cold meal from his supplies, the sounds of his chewing and the rustle of the packaging unnaturally loud in the vast silence. His academic texts lay unopened. The atmosphere of Blackwood Manor was too potent, too distracting. It demanded his full attention. Later, as the fire settled into a low, smoldering glow, Elias found himself simply listening. The house groaned and sighed around him. The wind began to pick up, rattling the ill-fitting window panes, creating soft, breathy whistles that seemed to weave through the very fabric of the walls. He heard the distant, insistent scratching of the oak tree against the terrace, and then something else. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the brushing of fabric against stone. It wasn't the wind, he was certain. It seemed to come from the hallway, just outside the study door. He held his breath, his heart thrumming against his ribs. He strained his ears, his body tensing, every nerve on edge. The sound was so fleeting, so soft, he almost convinced himself it was merely the settling of the old house or his imagination overwrought by the solitude and the oppressive atmosphere. But then it came again, a subtle scrape, like a fingernail dragging lightly across a rough surface, followed by a barely audible thump, as if something light had been set down. The sounds moved, not directly towards him, but seemingly passing the study door, heading towards the main hall. Elias slowly, painstakingly reached for the heavy iron poker beside the fireplace. The cold metal felt surprisingly reassuring in his hand. He rose, inch by agonizing inch, the floorboards creaking beneath his weight like a chorus of protest. He moved towards the study door, his movements deliberate, silent. He pressed his ear to the cold wood. Nothing. Only the faint whistling of the wind, the distant groan of the house, and the frantic pounding of his own blood in his ears. He waited, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. Then a sudden, sharp rap. It wasn't on the study door. It was upstairs. A single, distinct tap, 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 as if someone were lightly knocking on a wooden surface. It was too clear, too deliberate to be a mere house sound. And it was followed by a chilling, undeniable realization. The sound had come from directly above the study. Elias gripped the poker tighter, his knuckles white. He hadn't explored the upstairs yet. He told himself it was an animal, a rat, perhaps. But the rhythmic, almost intentional nature of the sound defied that explanation. It sounded like an inquiry, like something was asking for an answer. The air in the study, warmed by the fire, suddenly felt icy cold. He could feel the fine hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, a primal alarm screaming through his senses. He wasn't alone. He couldn't be. He rationalized, desperately, about the wind, about old pipes, about shadows and sounds playing tricks. But the conviction, cold and sharp as a surgeon's blade, had already taken root. He was being watched from within the house. And whatever it was no longer content to simply observe in silence. It was making itself known. The silence of Blackwood Manor, he now understood, had merely been a prelude. The performance had begun. The iron poker felt like a mere twig in Elias's trembling hand. The distinct tap, tap, tap from directly above the study had severed the fragile thread of his self-deception. It wasn't the house settling. It wasn't the wind. It was deliberate. It was an acknowledgement, an invitation, or more chillingly, a warning. His breath hitched, turning to visible vapor even in the relative warmth of the study fire. The flames, once a comforting presence, now seemed to shrink back, their light swallowed by the encroaching shadows that writhed on the walls. The air, which had briefly smelled of wood smoke, now carried a faint, unsettling aroma, a mix of damp earth, stagnant water, and something else, something cloying and ancient, like lilies left to rot. He stood frozen, listening, every muscle coiled. The house was silent again, but it was a different silence now, one charged with an undeniable presence. It was the silence of a predator holding its breath, waiting for its prey to make a move. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat in the vast, still chamber. He could feel it in his ears, a rushing tide that threatened to drown out any other sound. He tried to rationalize, to cling to the last vestiges of academic detachment. Rats, large rats, or a squirrel, an old house full of rodents. But the cadence of the taps had been too precise, too measured. Not the scurry of an animal, but the articulate impact of something with purpose. The thought of staying in the study, sealed in by his fear, was unbearable. The space, which had felt like a sanctuary moments before, now felt like a cage. If something was upstairs, watching him, he needed to know. Not to confront it, but to understand its proximity, its nature. Or perhaps his own foolish pride demanded that he prove his sanity, even if only to himself. Slowly, deliberately, Elias moved towards the study door, the poker still clutched like a lifeline. He pushed the heavy oak door open a fraction, just enough to peer into the main hall. It was a chasm of darkness, the feeble light from his study fire barely penetrating its gloom. The grand staircase, a monstrous spine of carved wood, rose into the blackness like a stairway to an abyss. He stepped out, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The cold in the hall was immediate, a visceral shock that leached the heat from his bones. It was a distinct, localized cold, not the general chill of an old house, but an invading frost that seemed to emanate from the upper floors. His breath plumed thicker now, each exhalation a cloud of dread. As he looked up the staircase, a sound, almost imperceptible, reached him. A faint rustle, like dry leaves skittering across a floor, or silk against stone. It seemed to drift from the very top of the stairs, then subtly shifted, moving from left to right, as if something unseen was pacing, surveying the descent. He gripped the poker tighter, his knuckles white. "Hello?" His voice, a raw whisper, sounded alien and pathetically small in the cavernous space. It was immediately swallowed by the oppressive silence, leaving no echo. Only the faint, almost imperceptible shh of the rustling seemed to answer, now seeming to be directly above the landing, slightly to his right. He lifted his lantern, its beam cutting a trembling path through the dense shadows. The light seemed absorbed by the darkness, unable to fully dispel it. Each step he took towards the staircase felt like wading through thick, cold water. The banister, intricately carved with forgotten beasts, felt like ice beneath his fingers. He began his ascent. Each step was an ordeal. The old wood groaned and complained, its ancient voice adding to the symphony of his terror. Midway up, a sudden sharp gust of wind seemed to sweep down the staircase, though no windows were open in the hall below. It wasn't just cold, it felt like a deliberate touch, a brush against his cheek, an invisible breath on his ear. A whisper, so low it was almost subliminal, seemed to accompany it, dissolving into the air before he could grasp its meaning. Mine? Or time? He couldn't be sure. His mind was playing tricks. It had to be. He reached the landing, his legs aching, his heart hammering. The upper hall was even colder, a freezing pocket of air that seemed to suck the warmth from his lungs. The shadows here were absolute, deeper and more menacing than downstairs. The lantern beam revealed a long, wide corridor stretching into the darkness, lined with closed doors like silent, watchful sentinels. The air thrummed with a subtle, almost inaudible hum, like distant static or the vibration of deep silence. And then he heard it again. Footsteps. Not his own, but a soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. They weren't directly behind him, nor directly in front. They seemed to be circling, moving from a room to his left, passing the doorway, then continuing down the hall and seemingly around a corner, out of sight. The sound was muffled, as if the steps were being taken on thick carpet, or by something light, something that barely disturbed the floorboards. He spun, his lantern beam wildly sweeping the corridor. Nothing. Just the endless dark, the closed doors, and the profound, bone-chilling cold. The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the sounds. It felt expectant. Elias walked slowly down the hall, his own steps loud and clumsy. He tried to follow the imagined path of the footsteps. He passed the first door to his left, then the second. The third door, slightly ajar, caught his attention. It opened into what appeared to be a master bedroom. He pushed the door open fully. The room was immense, larger than his study, and even more shrouded in decay. A massive four-poster bed, draped in a tattered canopy, dominated the center, covered in a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. A vanity table, its mirror cracked and opaque with grime, stood against one wall. The air in here was heavy, almost suffocating, thick with the scent of dried roses and something else, something sickly sweet and metallic like old pennies and congealed grief. His lantern beam swept across the room. On the far wall, a portrait hung, mostly obscured by shadow and dust. As he slowly approached it, the light revealed a woman's face, pale and severe, her eyes dark, perhaps black. Her gaze, even in the faded paint, seemed to follow him, a perpetual silent judgment. He felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to avert his own eyes, as if meeting hers would seal some unspoken compact. He turned away, feeling a prickle on the back of his neck. That was when he heard it clearly. A low, insistent scratch, 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 coming from the far side of the room, near the window. Not the oak outside. This was internal. It sounded like something trapped, something trying to get out, or in. Elias moved towards the sound, his heart pounding a frantic drum against his ribs. He swept the lantern beam across the wall, searching for a source. The scratching stopped abruptly as the light hit the area. Nothing, just a patch of peeling wallpaper. He leaned closer, his breath held. The air here was even colder, a pocket of Arctic chill that made his teeth ache. Then, just as he was about to dismiss it, a faint whisper brushed past his right ear, so close he felt a shiver run down his entire body. It was not a language he understood, merely a breathy, drawn-out syllable, like a sigh of profound sorrow or a sound of deep, ancient satisfaction. Shh. He whirled, the poker raised, his mind screaming in panic's denial. There was nothing, just the vast, empty room, the silent, judging portrait, and the oppressive, chilling presence that now seemed to envelop him completely. The cold intensified, pressing in from all sides, a tangible weight. He could feel it on his exposed skin, a clammy, unseen touch. The rustling returned, louder this time, originating from within the room itself, near the bed. It wasn't just cloth. It sounded like dry, brittle bones shifting, like something trying to rise. And then a soft, deliberate tap came from the wall beside him. Not the insistent tap, tap, tap from earlier, but a single, soft, knowing tap, as if something had just reached out and touched the wood. Elias stumbled back, fear a bitter taste in his mouth. He could feel its proximity, a heavy, suffocating weight in the air. He couldn't see it, but he knew it was there, closer than he could bear, observing him, sensing him. The whispers returned, surrounding him now, like a chorus of unseen voices, too low to discern, but undeniably present, weaving in and out of his hearing, moving from his left ear to his right, then fading into the walls. They were not human, not animal. They were something else, something ancient and hungry. He backed out of the room, not daring to turn his back, his eyes darting frantically into the shadows, convinced he would see a fleeting glimpse of something, a movement, a shape, but there was nothing. Only the encroaching darkness, the whispers, and the overwhelming feeling of a gaze, a perpetual, silent gaze, fixed upon him, unwavering. He retreated down the hall, his steps quickening, a desperate flight from an unseen hunter. He almost tripped descending the staircase, his footing unsure on the groaning steps. He burst back into the study, slamming the heavy door shut behind him, jamming the poker beneath the handle. He collapsed onto his cot, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. The fire had dwindled to embers, its warmth barely perceptible against the profound chill that had followed him down. He pulled his blankets tight, shivering violently. He knew, with an absolute, terrifying certainty, that he was no longer alone in Blackwood Manor. And whatever shared this space with him, it was now awake. It was aware of his fear, and it was no longer content to simply watch. He could still feel the phantom brush of cold air on his cheek, the echo of the whispers in his ears, and the terrifying, undeniable sense that the unseen eyes were still upon him, even through the thick oak of the door, even through the stone walls. It was waiting, and the night had just begun. The iron poker had become an extension of Elias's terror, clutched so tightly his fingers ached with a dull throb. The study, once a promising refuge, had dissolved into a fragile illusion, barely holding back the encroaching darkness and the things that now stirred within Blackwood Manor. The fire, a dying ember, offered no solace, its meager warmth lost to the pervasive chill that seemed to have permeated the very stone of the room. He could still feel the phantom brush of cold air on his cheek, the echo of the whispers in his ears, and the terrifying, undeniable sense that the unseen eyes were still upon him, even through the thick oak of the door, even through the stone walls. It was waiting, and the night had just begun. He tried to force logic into the chaos of his mind. It's just an old house, settling, the wind, overactive imagination. But the memory of the tap, tap, tap upstairs, the circling footsteps, the scratch, scratch, scratch by the portrait, and above all, the intimate, icy whisper directly beside his ear shattered every rationalization. This was not the settling of an old house. This was malevolent awareness. A low groan emanated from the floorboards directly above him, a drawn-out sound like a heavy weight being dragged across the floor. Elias flinched, his head snapping up. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, to make it disappear. But it persisted, a slow, deliberate scrape that moved almost imperceptibly from one side of the room directly above to the other, then paused. The silence that followed was even more profound, more pregnant with unspoken threat. He felt a deep, vibrating chill seep into his cot, rising through the thin mattress and blankets, seizing his limbs. It wasn't merely cold air. It was a cold that felt sentient, deliberate, designed to strip away his warmth, his comfort, his resolve. His teeth began to chatter, a rhythm he couldn't control. Then the whispers began again. Not singular, not distinct, but a chorus of faint, breathy murmurs that seemed to emanate from the very walls of the study. They moved, weaving in and out of his hearing, sometimes seeming to be right beside his left ear, then drifting to his right, then fading into the distant corners of the room. They were too low to discern, a cacophony of indiscernible syllables, like 1,000 secrets being breathed into the stone, surrounding him, enveloping him. The sound was like dry leaves skittering across a vast empty space, or the soft hiss of a forgotten breath. He clamped his hands over his ears, pressing hard, trying to shut out the sound, but it seeped through his fingers, a relentless invasion. He rocked back and forth, a primal response to an incomprehensible threat. This was not the solitude he had sought for his research. This was an eradication of solitude, an unbearable, oppressive togetherness with something unseen and utterly alien. A sudden sharp tap came from the study door, directly beside the poker he jammed into the handle. It was not a violent sound, but a precise, knowing tap, as if something was acknowledging his pathetic attempt at barricading himself. The sound was followed by a soft, almost imperceptible rustle, as if a heavy, unseen fabric was being brushed against the wood. Then a slow, deliberate slide, as if something was being dragged across the floor just outside the door, inching closer. Elias's breath hitched. He stared at the door, his eyes wide, unblinking. He could feel its presence on the other side, a cold, watchful weight. He imagined it standing there, just beyond the oak, its unseen form pressed against the wood, listening to his ragged breathing, savoring his terror. He couldn't stay like this. He couldn't. His sanity, already stretched thin, would unravel completely. He needed to understand. He needed to know. Or at least to gather more information, to intellectualize this horror before it consumed him whole. His academic instinct, dormant under the initial shock, began to stir, a desperate attempt to regain control. His gaze fell upon the journal on the oak desk, its leather cover dark and ancient, its pages yellowed and brittle. He remembered seeing it earlier, lying open, its script faded. It was a tangible connection to the house's past, perhaps to its secrets. He pushed himself up from the cot, his limbs stiff with cold and fear. The whispers seemed to intensify as he moved, swirling around him, a mocking chorus. The rustling sound outside the door paused as he stood, then resumed, a slow, rhythmic shh, shh, as if keeping pace with his movements. He stumbled towards the desk, his lantern beam shaking wildly. The journal lay open exactly as he'd left it. He reached out a trembling hand, hesitated, then forced himself to touch the brittle pages. The paper was cold, like ice, and felt strangely thin, almost translucent. He brought the lantern closer, its light illuminating the elegant, looping script. The ink was faded, difficult to read, but as his eyes adjusted, fragments of words, then sentences began to form. It appeared to be a personal diary, detailing daily observations. The language was archaic, the hand formal. October 17th, 1873. The chill has settled early this year. A peculiar dampness permeates the very stone, a cold that no fire can truly dispel. Eleanor complains of a persistent cough. Her spirit, however, remains unbroken, though her eyes hold a certain veiled quality. She speaks often of the quiet watchers. Elias paused, his heart giving a jolt. Quiet watchers. The phrase resonated with a chilling familiarity. He could almost feel them, even now, surrounding him, their unseen gazes fixed upon him. He continued to read, his fingers tracing the delicate lines of script. November 2nd, 1873. Eleanor's cough has worsened. She spends hours by the window, staring into the woods, speaking to no one. She claims they follow her glance, these watchers. She whispers of a presence, a breath that is not air, a touch that leaves no mark but cold. A sudden, sharp drop in temperature filled the study. Elias gasped, his breath pluming thick and white before his face. The whispers intensified, now seeming to coalesce, forming a distinct, high-pitched hum that vibrated in the air around him. The rustling outside the door became more frantic, a flurry of hurried motion, as if something was pacing rapidly, agitated. November 15th, 1873. The doctor offers tinctures, but they do nothing. Eleanor grows weaker. Her mind, however, seems to sharpen, though in a frightful way. She describes them now, not as watchers, but as the perpetual gaze. Always there, always observing, always hungry. She says they want to know her, to consume her thoughts, her very essence. She hears them, she says, in the walls, in the wind, in the silence. Their whispers are like the sigh of the grave. Elias's blood ran cold. The perpetual gaze.
He felt it now, more acutely than ever before. It wasn't just observing, it was probing, delving, seeking to understand him, to know him, to consume. The words from the journal were a mirror to his own horrifying experience. He flipped the page, desperate for answers, for an explanation, for a way out. November 20th, 1873. Eleanor is gone, vanished from her bed in the night, no trace. Only the open window and the bitter cold that permeated her room, and a single, small gray feather on her pillow. The house is silent now, but it is a deeper silence, a waiting silence. I hear the whispers now, too. I feel the gaze. It is no longer content to merely watch. It seeks an audience. It desires interaction. It desires entry.
Elias's eyes widened, scanning the last, almost illegible lines. Entry. A desperate, primal scream clawed at his throat. He understood now. Eleanor hadn't simply vanished, she had been taken, and the entity, the perpetual gaze, was here, and it wanted him. A profound, chilling cold swept through the study, extinguishing the last embers of the fire in the hearth with a soft, mournful hiss. The room was plunged into absolute darkness, save for the weak, trembling beam of his lantern. The whispers, no longer indistinct, seemed to form a single elongated sound, a drawn-out "sssss" that vibrated deep within his bones. Then, from the darkness, a new sound emerged. A soft, wet squelch, like bare skin being pressed against a cold, slick surface, followed by a faint drag that seemed to originate from directly behind him, near the tall bookshelves. It wasn't the rustling of cloth. This was organic, heavy, and utterly abhorrent. He spun around, his lantern beam cutting a wild arc through the oppressive black. Nothing, just the rows of silent, shadowed books. But the air here, behind the desk, was suddenly thick, heavy, almost viscous. It smelled distinctly of damp earth, stagnant water, and that sickly sweet, metallic aroma. The scent of lilies left to rot, now stronger, suffocating. A sudden sharp snap echoed through the room. Elias flinched, his head whipping towards the sound. It came from the bookshelf directly in front of him, the one he had just illuminated. He stared, unblinking, as a single, large volume, its spine dark and aged, slowly, deliberately began to slide forward from its resting place on the shelf. It moved with an unnatural smoothness, defying gravity, until it hung suspended in the air for a breath before dropping with a heavy thud onto the floor. Elias stumbled back, knocking his chair over with a clatter that reverberated through the now utterly silent room. He stared at the fallen book, then at the empty space on the shelf. It was impossible. There was no draft, no tremor. It had been moved deliberately. The whispers returned, now clearer, more focused, coalescing into a single, low, guttural murmur that seemed to fill his head, not just his ears. It wasn't English, but it was a language of pure malice, a guttural purr of ancient hunger. It moved around him, circling closer and closer, like an invisible predator tightening its coil. He felt the cold again, not just on his skin, but deep within his chest, seizing his very core. It pressed in, a physical weight, suffocating him. He could feel its presence now, right behind him, a vast, formless shadow that blotted out all light, all warmth. He could feel its breath, icy and fetid, on the back of his neck. Then a single, cold, unseen finger traced a path down his spine, leaving a searing trail of ice in its wake. A whisper, distinct and bone-chilling, articulated itself directly into his left ear, so close he felt the vibration against his eardrum. "You are seen." The words were elongated, drawn out, delivered in a voice that was both whisper and groan, ancient and utterly devoid of warmth. It was undeniably a voice, and it was speaking to him. Elias let out a choked cry, dropping the lantern. It clattered to the floor, its beam flickering wildly, then dying, plunging the study into absolute suffocating darkness. He was blind. He was utterly, completely blind. And he was not alone. The whispers exploded around him, a cacophony of unseen voices, laughing, mocking, closing in. He scrambled backward, desperate, animalistic, until his back hit the cold stone wall. The poker had fallen from his grip. He was defenseless. The perpetual gaze was upon him, and it had finally found its voice and its touch. The house was no longer merely watching, it was claiming. Part 4. The world dissolved into a black, howling void around Elias. The study, once his last bastion of fragile sanity, became an arena of sensory assault. The dropped lantern lay somewhere in the suffocating darkness, its beam extinguished, leaving him utterly blind. The whispers, a cacophony of unseen voices, no longer merely surrounded him. They clawed at the inside of his skull, a maddening chorus of ancient hunger and malice. They were closer now, individual syllables forming and dissolving, too fast to grasp, yet conveying an undeniable message of invasion. The words, "You are seen," echoed in the cavern of his mind, not fading, but reverberating with an icy finality. He scrambled backward, a primal, desperate instinct for survival driving him, until his back hit the cold, rough stone wall. His fingers, numb with terror, fumbled for the poker, but it was lost somewhere in the abyss of the floor. He was utterly defenseless. The cold that had permeated the room intensified, no longer just a chill, but a crushing weight. It felt like he was plunged into liquid nitrogen, every nerve screaming. He could feel it pressing against his skin, seeping into his clothes, leaching the very warmth from his core. His breath plumed thick and ragged, but the air he inhaled felt like frozen dust, burning his lungs. The scratching began again, not from the walls this time, but from the floor, moving towards him. It was a dry, brittle, scratch, 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 like skeletal fingers dragging across rough wood, accompanied by a soft, wet squelch, a sound of sickening adhesion and release. It moved slowly, deliberately, circling him, a predatory crawl in the absolute darkness. He could feel the vibrations through the stone wall against his back, a subtle tremor that seemed to travel directly into his bones. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. He closed his eyes, as if that would somehow make the unseen disappear. But the darkness behind his eyelids was no different from the darkness of the room. He felt utterly exposed, vulnerable, a raw nerve ending in a hostile, unseen world. A low, guttural growl, not human, not animal, but something ancient and deep, rumbled from the darkness in front of him. It was a sound that seemed to come from the very foundations of the house, reverberating through the floor, up the walls, and into his chest. It was a sound of immense power, of unfathomable age, and it was directed solely at him. Then the whispers shifted. They coalesced, forming distinct, fragmented sentences, delivered in a low, sibilant tone that moved from his left ear to his right, then seemed to hover just behind his head, as if an unseen mouth was pressed against his skin. He came for us. We waited so long. Another to know us. To become part of the gaze. The words were broken, fragmented, but their meaning was brutally clear. This entity, or entities, had been waiting for someone like him. Someone who sought solitude, who delved into the unseen. He was not merely a guest, he was sustenance. A faint, chilling wind, carrying the sickly sweet scent of decaying lilies and something metallic, brushed past his face. So close he felt the strands of his hair stir. It was followed by a wet, clicking sound, like mandibles opening and closing, directly in front of him, yet too low to see, too indistinct to pinpoint. He pushed himself up, trying to move, to escape, but his legs felt like lead. His hands flailed in the darkness, searching for anything, any object to defend himself, to give him a sense of purchase. His fingers brushed against something cold, hard, and cylindrical, the poker. He seized it, gripping the iron with desperate strength. Its cold weight was a tiny spark of resolve in the overwhelming darkness. He swung it wildly, blindly into the void in front of him, hoping to connect with something, anything. The heavy metal met only air, a hollow swish that was immediately swallowed by the oppressive silence that followed his desperate act. But the silence was fleeting. A low, mocking chuckle, dry and brittle like rustling leaves, emanated from just above him, seemingly from the ceiling itself. It was a sound of ancient amusement, of triumph. Then the physical manifestations began. A sudden sharp pinch on his forearm, like a fingernail digging deep. He cried out, instinctively tearing his arm away, but there was nothing there, no hand, no visible assailant. Yet the pain was real, a stinging sensation that lingered. Next, a cold, heavy pressure settled on his shoulders, pushing him down, forcing him to crouch. He struggled against it, straining every muscle, but the pressure was immense, unyielding, as if an invisible weight of impossible mass was pinning him. He could feel the cold seeping into his collarbone, radiating through his chest. The whispers intensified, now seeming to be spoken directly into both ears simultaneously, overlapping, creating a disorienting, maddening cacophony. Join us, Elias. Become the eyes. Forever watching. He could hear other sounds now, too. Faint footsteps, not circling, but marching in unison, coming from the main hall, growing louder, closer. They were not heavy human steps, but light, rhythmic patter, 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 like many small, unseen feet moving with deliberate speed. The sound was accompanied by the rustling of brittle fabric, a dry shh, like 1,000 ancient gowns sweeping the marble floor.
Panic seized him in a fresh, overwhelming wave. He was being surrounded, not just by the singular entity in the study, but by others, the quiet watchers from the journal. He fought against the invisible weight on his shoulders, roaring with frustrated terror. With a surge of adrenaline, he managed to push himself upright, shaking off the oppressive pressure. He swung the poker again, this time aiming lower, blindly hoping to connect with the source of the scratching. The poker hit something, not solid wood or stone, but something soft and yielding, yet strangely resilient. A wet tearing sound, like flesh ripping, followed by a high-pitched guttural shriek that was immediately cut short. The air in front of him momentarily thickened, turning icy cold before dissipating. The scratching stopped, the growling ceased, the multitude of whispers fell silent, replaced by a sudden, profound, and utterly terrifying stillness. Elias stood, panting, clutching the poker, his body trembling violently. What had he hit? What kind of creature made such a sound? The silence was absolute, heavier than anything before, charged with a palpable sense of shock. Then, something else, an ancient, simmering rage. He could feel the change in the atmosphere. The pressure was gone, but the cold remained, now imbued with a furious intensity. The air felt brittle, ready to shatter. He was no longer merely prey. He had dared to strike back. Then a single, deliberate thump came from the far side of the study, near where he dropped the lantern. It was followed by a soft, clinking sound, like metal on stone. The lantern, and it was being moved. A faint, sickly green glow began to emanate from that corner, growing steadily. Not the bright, focused beam of his LED, but a diffuse, unnatural luminescence, like foxfire or decaying phosphorus.
It cast long, distorted shadows that writhed and twisted across the walls, making the bookshelves appear to writhe with unseen forms. The green light grew, revealing the outline of the fallen lantern, now seemingly floating a few inches above the floor, pulsing with the eerie glow. And then, from behind it, a shape began to emerge. Not a solid form, not flesh and blood, but a swirling vortex of shadows, darker than the surrounding darkness, yet somehow visible against it. It was amorphous, shifting, yet with a distinct humanoid outline, tall and impossibly thin. Its center seemed to be a swirling void, a point of absolute nothingness that drew in the light and warmth. As it solidified, Elias could make out faint, shimmering outlines within its shadowy form. These were not bones or organs, but countless indistinct faces pressed together, their features contorted in silent agony, their eyes, thousands of them, dark and vacant, all staring out, all fixed upon him. The perpetual gaze materialized. The green light intensified, now revealing the floor around the entity, and there, beside the swirling mass of shadows and faces, lay the book he had dropped earlier. Its pages were no longer merely yellowed, they were stained, dark and wet, with what appeared to be glistening black fluid. And next to it, on the cold marble, was a small gray feather, identical to the one mentioned in the journal, the one found on Eleanor's pillow. The entity shifted, its multitude of faces turning in unison towards him, their silent mouths agape. A single, distinct whisper, not in his ear, but seemingly from the collective throats of the thousands of faces, filled the room, amplified, resonant, and utterly devoid of mercy. "You struck us." The green light pulsed, illuminating the poker still clutched in Elias's hand. He looked down at it. On its tip, glistening in the unnatural glow, was a dark, viscous residue. He had indeed struck it. He had drawn its attention, its wrath. The shadowy entity began to glide forward, slowly, deliberately, its multitude of eyes fixed upon him, its form expanding, filling the room. The whispers returned, a deafening roar in his mind, and the faint, rhythmic patter-patter-patter of unseen feet in the hall outside began to grow louder, faster, rushing towards the study door. He was trapped. The perpetual gaze had finally fully revealed itself, and it was coming for him. Part 5. The green phosphorescent glow intensified, casting the shadowy entity into stark, ghastly relief. It glided forward, a towering, amorphous mass of swirling darkness, yet its form was undeniably humanoid, impossibly tall and thin, like a column of solidified dread. Within its shifting blackness, the thousands of indistinct faces writhed, their features a silent scream of agony and despair. Their vacant eyes, countless and obsidian, all fixed upon Elias. The perpetual gaze had fully materialized, and it was coming for him. The whispers, no longer merely an auditory torment, swelled into a deafening roar within his skull, a cacophony of ancient voices speaking simultaneously, overlapping, intertwining, forming a maddening symphony of malice. He understood none of the words, yet their meaning was conveyed with brutal, visceral clarity. He was theirs. The air around the entity shimmered, vibrating with an unnatural cold that stole the breath from Elias's lungs. He stumbled back, his legs refusing to obey, until his back was once again pressed against the rough, unyielding stone of the wall. The poker, still clutched in his trembling hand, felt utterly useless against such an insurmountable otherworldly force. Just as the shadowy entity began to close the distance, a thunderous crash reverberated through the study. The heavy oak door, which Elias had so desperately barricaded, splintered inward with a violent crack, torn from its ancient hinges. A torrent of bone-chilling wind, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, surged into the room, extinguishing the sickly green glow of the lantern. Absolute darkness swallowed him again, but this time it was a darkness filled with movement. The rhythmic patter-patter-patter of unseen feet exploded into the study, no longer distant but immediate, surrounding him. He felt faint touches brushing against his clothes, his hair, his skin, cold, dry, like papery leaves or ancient brittle cloth. The rustling sound became a furious, agitated symphony, 1,000 unseen entities swarming, closing in. He swung the poker wildly, blindly, a desperate reflex. The heavy iron connected with something solid, not yielding flesh this time, but something hard and brittle like dry bone. A sharp snap echoed, followed by a faint, high-pitched wail that was abruptly choked off, swallowed by the overwhelming chaos. He had struck one of them, one of the quiet watchers, but his victory, if it could be called that, was fleeting and meaningless. The vast, shadowy entity, the perpetual gaze, was upon him. He felt its presence before any physical contact, an impossible cold that bypassed his skin and sank directly into his marrow, seizing his very core. It was a cold that screamed of eons spent in absence, a cold that promised endless, sterile desolation. Then the physical invasion began. Not a single touch, but a multitude. Invisible hands, cold and dry, brushed against his face, his arms, his chest. They were not grasping, but caressing, exploring, as if familiarizing themselves with his form. He felt them slide beneath his clothes, their touch like icy tendrils crawling across his skin, probing, mapping his anatomy. The whispers intensified, weaving into a single droning chant that filled his mind, erasing all other thoughts. Become the many. See through us, forever watching. He screamed, a raw, animalistic sound ripped from his throat, but it was swallowed by the overwhelming chorus of whispers, lost in the suffocating embrace of the unseen. He felt the entity's form envelop him, not as a solid mass, but as a swirling vortex of cold, insubstantial darkness. He was being absorbed, drawn into its boundless, horrifying depths. His vision blurred, not just from the darkness, but from an internal distortion. He could see faint, swirling shapes within the black, translucent forms that seemed to be his own limbs, his own body, dissolving, becoming one with the shadowy mass. The faces, thousands of them, pressed in on him, their vacant eyes now seeming to merge with his own, their silent screams echoing in his dissolving consciousness. He felt a searing, agonizing pain, not physical, but existential. It was the pain of his individuality being flayed, his selfhood unraveling. His memories, his thoughts, his very identity were being ripped from him, piece by agonizing piece, dissolving into a vast collective consciousness. He saw flashes of his life, his studies, his quiet apartment, the excited anticipation of Blackwood Manor, all flashing before his eyes, then fading, becoming indistinct, merging with countless other, older memories. The cold intensified, becoming a burning agony, yet paradoxically he felt nothing. He was no longer Elias, he was a sensation, a thought, a fragment. He was no longer breathing, yet he existed. He was no longer seeing with his own eyes, yet he saw everything.
He was a new eye, added to the perpetual gaze. He was a new voice, a new whisper in the maddening chorus. The last vestige of Elias Thorne, the academic who sought profound solitude, dissolved. His final fleeting thought was of the utter, horrifying irony. He had come seeking isolation and had found instead an eternal, unbearable communion. The study, now silent, was once again plunged into darkness. The shattered door hung askew, a gaping maw. The fallen lantern lay forgotten, its green glow extinguished. On the cold marble floor, near the stained journal, a single, pristine gray feather lay beside a small, dark puddle of viscous, black fluid. The heavy book, its pages still open to Eleanor's chilling words, remained. The house settled into a deeper, more profound silence.
A waiting silence. In the master bedroom upstairs, the ancient portrait on the far wall seemed to subtly shift. The woman's painted eyes, once merely dark and severe, now held a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer. And in the depths of those eyes, in the very reflection of the darkness of the room, a new pair of eyes seemed to emerge, joining the countless others, staring out, forever watching. Elias Thorne was gone, but a new pair of eyes had been added to Blackwood Manor, and the perpetual gaze, now strengthened, now more complete, continued its eternal vigil from the darkest corners of the house, waiting for the next one. Waiting for the next scholar, the next lonely soul, the next seeker of solitude to walk through its iron gate and become part of the silent, hungry observation. The wind outside picked up, sweeping through the shattered door, carrying with it a faint, low whisper, now carrying a new, almost discernible, guttural murmur. "We see you."